take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the fact that the number of cases of COVID-19 have risen dramatically in the state of Texas, and then the whole issue of masks. Do we have to keep talking about this? I guess so, because what we're finding out is masks are very important for most people, except when it isn't important. And you'll get a good understanding about that in just a minute. We do also have the appeals court saying that Michael Flynn's case needs to be dismissed. We would hope that, given the fact that this is a ruling from the District of Columbia Appeals Court, that would be the end of it. But again, I know enough about the judge that's making this issue. We'll see whether that is indeed the case. And it really is pretty simple. If the prosecution says we're not going to prosecute, the case should be over. Well, usually, but not in this case. And I think I'll wait till the next hour to talk about Bubba Wallace. Got to do that, but we'll get to that later. By the way, those are just a few of the small topics, because we're also in between all of those topics talking with Ken Stevens about Engage Hope. Dede Laugesen will be with us about this executive order from the president promoting international religious freedom and what that might mean. And then in the next hour, the 2 o'clock hour, we're about 2:15 to 3 o'clock Dallas time, since we're in Dallas at the moment. Janelle Alberts and Ingrid Faro, honest answers, exploring God questions with your tween. So we're going to do some apologetics. We're going to do some religious liberty. We're going to talk a little bit about evangelism and outreach. We're going to talk about various race issues, COVID issues, and a variety of other topics over these next 3 hours. So I hope you'll stick with us as we try to cover the landscape of what is out there. Now, the first point is, one of the articles I have posted comes from our friends at the Dallas Morning News. And it basically says the Texas cases hit an all-time high. Now, you can look at the number of new cases going up behind Governor Abbott. You can see the positivity rate, which was going down and then now going back up, which I think could in part be due to the fact that the more testing you do, the more you find people that are testing positive but are still pretty much asymptomatic. But nevertheless, there are all sorts of drum beats, all sorts of echoes of thunder in the background that maybe some states will want to go to a second lockdown, and Texas trying to avoid that. But nevertheless, you're having the governor say some things I don't think he would have said even a month ago, and that is he's now warning Texans of the rampant spread of the coronavirus that took the state to a new high yesterday of more than 5,000 new cases in a single day. Now, he said that Texans should stay home unless they have a good reason to venture out. He also said that local officials are been given more power to limit gatherings and, of course, to get us into the topic I want to address now, and that is the issue of masks. One of the things you may have seen, but this, of course, comes from Oregon, so it may not have been on one of your news feeds. The lesson that we're getting from a county in Oregon right now, Lincoln County in particular, is that if you are white, you need to wear a mask. If you are black, you do not. What? I don't even understand that. Well, let's get into it a little bit. That's the lesson from the one Oregon county where the directive required all residents 12 years and over to wear masks in indoor settings outside the hospital or outdoors where they were going to be near somebody. But the bottom line is that it also said that this is a requirement that comes from Lincoln County by the health department, but it specifically exempts non-Caucasians, also referred to oftentimes as people of color. So if you're Hispanic or you're black, then you don't have to wear the mask. Now, you might say, that makes no sense scientifically. No, but it does make a lot of sense if you're looking at social justice, not science, because they express the concern that people who are not Caucasian might actually have racial profiling, so wearing a mask would be something that they are not requiring anybody that is called a person of color to actually do. Now, of course, you can see that it illustrates exactly the point I've made. Masks are important, except when they're not important. And they're not important when people are out there protesting, but they are important when somebody's out there talking about their First Amendment right to protest against government lockdowns. It's okay to actually not have a mask if you're African American or Hispanic American, but you absolutely have to wear it if you're Anglo American. And you can kind of see where we're going with this. Now, one of the lawyers with Reason pointed out that I said, I appreciate the concern about racial profiling, but there's no way you can justify having one law for people of color and another for whites. That's because the Constitution, remember that thing we still supposedly believe in, has a very significant equal protection clause. That is, you can't have one set of laws for one group and a different set of laws for another. Of course, I recognize our elites have been like that for some time. And as you may have guessed, this has led to an incredible number of Twitter comments. One in particular here says, "Attention county commissioners of Lincoln County, Oregon, you have hired crazy people to work for you." One of them wanted to know how much color gets you to the no mask pass. Okay, how much melanin do I have to have before I don't have to wear one? And of course, then you have one individual saying, well, not wearing a mask is selfish because you will kill grandma. But killing grandma is fine as long as grandma's black because racial profiling. And then one just simply put out a tweet that said, science, which of course it's not. And if you needed any evidence, what is so striking to me is the evidence is piling in day after day of the fact that masks actually are very helpful. And yet, even as I saw someone post that on Facebook, I scroll down two more and have somebody posting something, which was actually said by Anthony Fauci, saying that masks are more kind of a talisman, or it maybe just causes people to have better behavior, but it really doesn't help. And of course, you remember the Surgeon General said something like this. So the people that are the worst enemies of the mask are the ones that now are telling us that we should be wearing them. But if you haven't seen this, we posted this article the other day, and this research that was posted in The Lancet, which is the premier medical journal for the UK, concluded data from 172 observational studies that wearing face masks reduce the risk of coronavirus infection. They went on to say that they are highly protective. Now, they did say that we do have a low certainty in that, and the reason for that is that the gold standard in science is a randomized, double-blind controlled trial, which is, of course, really difficult to do right now in a pandemic. But if nothing else, there is all sorts of evidence that is coming in. This one from Columbia University anecdotally appears that face mask use is an important control against multiple modes of SARS-CoV-2 transmission. And, of course, we have a variety of others. As I go to the break here, let me mention one. This a collection of articles, best way to reduce coronavirus transmission is by wearing a face mask. Here's another one. Wearing a face mask can reduce coronavirus transmission by up to 75% in a study that came out of Hong Kong. That one was the closest you get to sort of one of those gold standards, because they actually did these standards looking at airborne particles and things like that with hamsters. And since hamsters don't know the difference between wearing a mask or not, and of course the masks are actually put on these cages, they were able to demonstrate that in a way that I think any fair-minded person would think so. But nevertheless, we this week found that in Oregon, if you have a lot of melanin in your skin, you don't have to wear a mask. And that's science? Of course not. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In a recent PragerU video, former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper talked about two different types of people. He described these two groups in order to explain why Donald Trump won in 2016. I'll ignore his explanation and conclusion in this short commentary in order to focus on the impact of two people groups. He says there are many people who can live anywhere and many more people who have to live somewhere. David Goodhart makes this important distinction in his book, The Road to Somewhere. He explains that this is a key fault line in Britain between the anywheres and the somewheres. Stephen Harper believes this explains the populace rising in many countries, including the United States. He says, imagine you work for an international bank, computer company, or consulting firm. You wake up in New York, London, or Singapore and feel at home. Your work is not threatened by import competition or technological dislocation. You're one of those who can live anywhere. This is not the case for those who are forced to live somewhere. He says, let's say you're a factory worker, a small business person, or in retail sales. If things go badly at your company or policy choices by politicians turn out to be wrong, you can't just shift your life to somewhere else. Turns out that the anywheres are not really that affected by outsourcing, labor, cheap labor, or even technological imports. The somewheres are affected by all of these things and have become angry when the elites in government, media, and business seem unconcerned about the disruptions that occur because of policies by government officials and decisions by multinational companies. That is why more and more somewheres are making their voice heard in elections and in the populist movement. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, talk about something in the news, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but it is relevant in this sense. And if indeed you can take somebody like Michael Flynn, who has served in the military and has served under various presidents and was the former National Security Advisor, and you can use a, if you will, perjury trap to essentially send him to jail, which he has not gone to because now this particular case is probably going to be thrown out. If they can do that to the National Security Advisor for the sitting President of the United States, they can do it to you. So even if you find yourself saying, I really don't really care that much about what happens to this man, I don't know him, never met him, don't plan to ever run into him, I don't think it really is that relevant, just think again. Because this was a situation in which I think a person was sought out by the government and put in a situation that then forced him to eventually admit to something which I really don't think he ever actually did, but more importantly, to put him through this ringer just simply because people wanted to get him out of the way. There are some that have thought that maybe this was getting back at him because of some things he had said and done when he was working with the Obama administration. I think the better evidence comes from a number of people that have said, no, they were investigating and actually surveilling the President of the United States, and they had to get the National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, out of the way because having been in government, he would figure out only too soon what was taking place. But for whatever reason, the decision was for those that were sort of leftovers from the Obama administration decided to go after Michael Flynn. And so the federal court today ordered the judge to grant the Department of Justice's move to drop charges against the former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Three-judge panel basically approved Flynn's petition to intervene in the case after a district court judge, who I'll talk more about in just a minute, tapped even an outside counsel to argue against the move by the Department of Justice. And the panel actually said that Judge Emmett Sullivan overstepped his authority in second-guessing the prosecutor's decision. Their actual writing, this comes from Naomi Rao, and we've talked about her before. In this case, the district court's actions will result in specific harms to the exercise of the executive branch exclusive prosecutorial power. You can go on and make some case for it, but if you're not familiar with it, I did a commentary back on May 26th, in which I pointed out that if you really wanted to get a sense of what sometimes is wrong with the judiciary, all you have to do is look at this case. And probably the best commentary on this came from Alan Dershowitz, who is, of course, Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School. And he's been on the radio program a couple of times and basically has been sometimes willing to take on issues that his fellow liberals were quite willing to ignore. The case is pretty easy to summarize, and that is the Attorney General, William Barr, announced that the Justice Department would drop the charges against the former National Security Advisor. It's not surprising that the former it's not surprising that some of those officials have criticized that decision, some of those that used to be in the Justice Department. But what was surprising is the judge decided not to do that. Now, consider what is happening for just a minute. The prosecution has said, we've decided not to pursue charges. It would be appropriate to say the prosecutors and the defendants have agreed that the case should be dropped. So the case should be dropped. That should be the end of it, right? Wrong. Alan Dershowitz argues that once that decision is reached, quote, the court loses its constitutional authority to do anything but formally enter an order ending the case. But because there's no controversy to decide. And he laments that what happens as judges want more power than the Constitution provides. And I love one of the lines from one of his pieces. He said, not happy being umpires, they want to be commissioner of baseball. They have invented exceptions to give themselves jurisdiction over cases in which there is no longer any controversy between the litigants. And so, again, if you think that this was a miscarriage of justice, you could write editorials, you could sign open letters or petitions, you could have Congress investigate, but you can't have a judge decide that even after the case is over, that it's not over, and bring in someone on the outside to argue against that in the first place. So if nothing else, the Flynn case, if nothing else, reminds us that we really have to be vigilant and make sure that in certain circumstances we do not have a situation in which we are being prosecuted for some vindictive reason that has nothing to do with the law, and that certainly seemed to be the case with Michael Flynn. Of course, the argument is always made, well, he admitted to guilt. Well, that was because the various people prosecuting the case said, you know, if you don't admit to some guilt and cop some kind of plea, we will then go after your son. And, of course, a lot of this had to do with whether or not you are registered to be a lobbyist, something that is certainly a minor infraction, if you will, but it's certainly not worth putting somebody in prison for, certainly not putting your son in prison. And at a time when you've already lost your house and you've had to come up with huge legal fees and bills and all the rest, you can see why maybe he went along with that. But just before we take a break, this is, in some respects, the tip of the iceberg, because this investigation of how some of this happened and how the surveillance of Donald Trump took place has been investigated for some time by John Durham. And John Solomon has written a very good piece called 7 Big Hints that Barr, that would be the Attorney General, Bill Barr, has dropped about Durham, that would be John Durham's investigation of the Russian investigators. 7 points real quickly before we take a break. First of all, the timetable. Durham's investigation has been slowed by the pandemic, but some action is expected by the end of the summer, and the probe could stretch beyond the election day. If some of this comes out during the election time, everybody's going to say it was politically motivated, but That would have come out much earlier if we hadn't had the pandemic. Anyway, number two, Attorney General Barr believes that evidence used by the FBI to justify opening an investigation into the Trump campaign's ties to Moscow was very thin. He said that before and called it even a very slender read and those kinds of things. So that's another way in which he's tipping that there's some really significant things coming in the future. Number three, investigators are focused on what happened before Crossfire Hurricane officially started, including when Christopher Steele first began compiling his dossier, the dirty dossier that we've talked about on this program so many times before. Number four, Attorney General Barr views the FBI's continuation of the Russia probe after the Steele dossier collapsed as an illegitimate effort to remove the president. It turns out that was known to not to have been significant. It was known to be fraudulent, and yet it was used to get the FISA warrants that we've talked about on this program before. A couple more real quickly. There are multiple criminal investigations into leaks of classified information. That's become kind of a big issue right now because we recognize that some of those leaks were of very significant national security. And so those are going to be investigated as well. One of those, by the way, is who leaked the call from Michael Flynn to the Russian ambassador, because after all, it doesn't appear that some of the individuals that have that should have had access to it, and certainly the press, of course, wouldn't have had access to some of that. But two more real quickly. Attorney General Barr is concerned by the ongoing Obama administration's extensive unmasking of Americans' conversations. And so that is certainly one other very important issue, because when you are surveilling, in the particular case here of Michael Flynn, the Russian ambassador, you do not know who is making the phone call unless you get a specific request to unmask the name of an American. The focus there is to try to make sure that terrorism is not taking place, but it was used as a way to say, here are the people that I suspect the Trump administration will be calling. Some of them are foreigners, so we can actually surveil them. And then we can just then request an unmasking so that we know who actually made those phone calls and what they said. And number seven, John Durham is examining whether political pressures were applied during the intelligence community's assessment of Russia's intentions in the 2016 election meddling. And that could be bad news for former CIA Chief John Brennan, who, by the way, shows up on a lot of the talking head shows as well. So it shows that we are not at the end of this investigation. We're actually at the very beginning in some respects. And simply dropping the charges against Michael Flynn isn't kind of, well, one and done. It's actually just maybe a preview of coming attractions. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, Ken Stevens will be with us. We'll be talking about Engage Hope. It's something I think you would want to know about. And then a little bit later in the next hour, we'll be talking about an executive order by Donald Trump to promote international religious freedom. We'll also talk about apologetics in the last hour, how to maybe answer some of the questions those teenagers, those tweens sometimes ask. I think you'll really appreciate that conversation as well. So we've got a lot coming up, and we will be back right after these important messages.
Have you ever said, well, it can't get any worse than this? Here in 2020, I've stopped saying that. Just when you think difficulties have to end, it's something else. Never has there been a more important time to get good information about what's really happening in the nation and the world. And that means never has there been a more important time to jump on board the Point of View Truth Team. You have a critical role to play in stemming the tide of evil and participating in the cause for good. We have been called together for such a time as this, and all it takes is just a few minutes to visit our website or call us and join the team. Do that today. June is the end of our fiscal year, a time we're looking at what we can do in the second half of the year with so many big events ahead. And we really need to know that you are with us in the fight. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. We cannot afford to be silent. It is time for action. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
If you ever listen to Point of View, you know we spend so much time, if we can, talking about missions, evangelism, really being a light in a dark world. And so there are so many different ways to do that. But I thought for just a little while here, we would once again remind you about an organization called Engage Hope. It is something that I think you're going to find a great information about, and it may be something that you would want to be involved with, either with your financial gifts or even by willing to go and make a difference, to sponsor a child, to go on a trip and really begin to see what God is doing around the world. And so to help us understand this, we bring to the microphone Ken Stevens, who is originally from North Carolina. Interestingly enough, was really kind of in the business world, went to Uganda on an Engage Hope trip back in 2011. And that turned out to be just a life changer for him. And so I wanted him to spend some time talking about this. He has served, for example, as a deacon at Prestonwood Baptist Church. He is a graduate of Wake Forest University, as well as the University of North Carolina Law School. And he lives in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And Ken, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you for having me.
You got to tell the story. You know, here you are minding your own business, saying, yeah, okay, maybe it'd be good to go on a mission trip. And it changed everything, didn't it? Tell us the story if you might.
It really did. We had never, as a family, or me individually, had never gone on a mission trip of any type. And Engage Hope started the year before in 2010, and by a good friend of mine who really encouraged me and my wife and 3 daughters to go with him the summer of 2011. So a group of us went, and it literally changed all of our lives. And we as a family have been really involved with Engage Hope since that trip, and have been back many, many times. And I assumed this role that I currently have leading the ministry back in 2018.
Well, and again, I might just point out that you have had planned trips to Uganda. I don't know how, of course, with all this with COVID has changed that. It's changed all of us doing missions and things of that nature. But there are ways that people can participate, and I do want to talk about that. But let's, if we can, talk about some of the ministry partners that you have, because when you head out, it is, I think, really helpful for people if they're involved in any of these kind of short-term ministry outreaches, to be able to connect up with the American Hearts or Cross Healing Ministries or whatever it might be, because that's where the work is done. There's the evangelistic opportunity, but then there's the discipleship and the planting of churches. So kind of talk about your strategy and how you've been working with various ministry partners in different parts of the world.
Yes, thank you, Kerby. Yes, Engage Hope owns nothing in Uganda and Mexico. We work throughout all of Uganda and in the Chiapas region of Mexico, which is borders Guatemala. We work through the nationals in each country. Again, we own nothing. We do our work through nationals because they are in the best position to know what their needs are and how best the needs can be met. So we come alongside of them. Currently, Kerby, we have 11 ministry partners, 10 in Uganda and 1 in Mexico. And these ministry partners support and operate. We've got 8 schools, 3 slum ministries, church support, whether that be providing Bibles in the local dialect, pastor training, discipleship, as you mentioned. We work with 3 orphanages, and what we've really had to do this year is meet emergencies, just like COVID has had major impact to things in the U.S., and it's been particularly acute in Uganda and Mexico, where they locked down completely. So we have been providing food and education, literally education door to door, Bibles, because churches can't meet on a regular basis or in a larger group. So we have tried to continue the ministry and the work of the organization, but we've had to do it through different means. As you mentioned, trips. Typically, we have about 5 trips a year going to Mexico and 4 or so going to Uganda. Obviously, all those have stopped. So we, like many other ministries and like churches here in the U.S., have had to transition and change the way we do things. But it's just been great to see the people in Uganda and Mexico step up, and God's work is not going to stop, whether it be due to COVID or anything else.
Well, and one of the things that you did mention is, of course, when you are dealing with young people, whether it's the orphanage in Chiapas, Mexico, whether it's the slum ministry there in Uganda, those individuals were at risk on a normal day. I would imagine they're even more at risk at a time when just the whole food train and all the various ways in which we provide food, resources, even medical supplies has been interrupted by COVID-19. So let's talk about how people can participate. If people go to engagehope.org, the first thing that pops up is sponsor a child. And there are all sorts of other ways you can donate, but I'm looking and thinking about these nearly 100 boys in the slum ministry, or about 200 families or 500 children in another one that's in the Develop a Child Africa Ministries, or talking about the 120 orphans in Chiapas, Mexico. There's some real needs right now. Those have always been there, but they've even become more exacerbated, haven't they?
They really have become more exacerbated. And as you mentioned, our Sponsor a Child program, that has been the foundation of Engage Hope, and we have certainly expanded beyond that. But in Uganda, unlike here in the U.S., there is no free public education. So the poverty rate is, well, it's just incredible and indescribable to most Americans. And then on top of that, children cannot go to school unless their parents are able to pay, most of whom are not able to pay. So that's where Engage Hope comes in. And we have a robust Sponsor a Child program currently with about 800 kids sponsored, and their school fees are paid. It's $40 a month for primary school, which we call elementary, $55 a month for secondary or high school. And for this, they get full education. They get a meal a day, at least one meal. They get basic medical services or medical care. And for secondary school, they also have boarding privileges. So without these sponsorships, these kids would not be able to go to school. And do need to point out that we are committed as a Christian organization to providing a biblical-based education. We endeavor to provide an excellent academic education through our school ministry partners, but also, and most importantly, is biblical-based. That would be a great way for people to get involved, for sure.
I would think so.
And make immediate impact with many lives.
Let me just take a break, and we'll come back. We'll continue our conversation with Ken Stevens for a few more minutes, and you can go to engagehope.org. You don't have to remember it if you're driving right now, because we have the link there on our website, pointofview.net. Come back and ask a couple more kind of specific questions. Okay, if I sponsor a child, for example, can I write to that child? Can I send family pictures, or can I send a gift? What kind of things are involved there? And if I'm not necessarily wanting to just, sponsor a particular child, are there some other ways that I can support this ministry. And after all, someday we're all going to get to travel again. And I think some of you might want to say this might actually be a really good short-term mission trip in which, as Ken Stevens and his wife Amy went and said, this is going to change my life. And sometimes those can be life-changing, not only for you, but for your kids who sometimes complain that they don't have enough things. And they get to go to Uganda, they get to go to Mexico, and they're going, okay, that gives me a whole new priority here about what is and isn't important and what poverty really looks like and all the rest. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, Ken Stevens with us a little bit longer. By the way, if you have a question, maybe you have one real quickly that you would like to ask, feel free to give us a call, 800-351-1212. We'll stay with him for just a little bit longer, just so you know more about Engage Hope and what you can do during this time of uncertainty. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Ken Stevens with us for a few more minutes as we talk about Engage Hope. And Ken, before getting any further, we're talking about the possibility of sponsoring a child. And one of the questions that people might ask is, well, can I actually get to know that child, write to that child and send family pictures? I mean, I know that my wife and I over the years have sponsored various children through World Vision and Compassion International. This is very similar to that. But talk about what you can and are allowed to do in terms of engaging the child that you're sponsoring.
Yeah, Kerby, great question. We encourage letters to be written to them from sponsors to the sponsored child. We ensure that every one of those get to the child, and the child will always write back. Our 800 kids each send letters at least once a year. It's often more than that. Report cards are distributed or sent to each sponsor as well after each term. So the sponsor is able to see from an academic standpoint as well how their child is performing. And once travel gets back to normal and we resume trips to Mexico and Uganda, it is possible for sponsors to go and actually meet their child. That happens every single year, and needless to say, that is a highlight both for the child as well as for the sponsor.
Very good. Talk about the circumstances these children find themselves in. I would imagine that when we're talking about the slum ministry, they're at the lowest level possible of the economic ladder. Some of the others are maybe in different kinds of schools, but what exactly is life like for one of these children that some of our listeners might want to sponsor?
Yeah, it's HIV and AIDS actually began in Uganda, and because of that, it literally wiped out a generation. I'm in my 50s. You don't see people my age much in Uganda. Very, very young population, and many, many millions of orphans. And many of these boys and girls literally are living on the streets. In slums, there's no government support or anything. So our ministry partners, we've got, again, 3 slum ministries, bring boys and girls in. A lot of the girls are trapped in prostitution and then just doing whatever they can do to eat. And then they're brought into one of our ministry partners and really rehabilitated, re-socialized, and then placed in schools. And our ultimate goal is, again, for them to get a biblical education and become a self-sufficient citizen of Uganda. We had a great story recently. One of our orphans that we have supported through Kabali, Ebenezer Christian Academy, he worked his way through sponsorships all the way through university and has just recently this year sponsored a kid himself. So that's ultimately where we want to get them to. And, we're not, our goal is for them to be self-sufficient and for there to be community transformation, which, as we all know, begins with the individual and then spreads throughout the community and country.
Well, again, just before we run out of time, let's talk about how people can connect up to you. First of all, some of the individuals might say, I'd like to sponsor a child. And as I understand it, you can write to the child, send family pictures, maybe even send a gift or those kinds of things. So that's one. But as maybe some of our listeners are maybe pastors or they're on the missions committee of their local church. And it does seem to me that if you want to have an outreach, especially in this key area of Uganda, but also I'll mention, of course, what you're doing in Mexico. And if our church doesn't have any outreach, this would be just a great way to begin that. So can people contact you and then figure out more about possible support and what that might involve? Because I think there are certainly a number of people that are hearing this and saying, I might like to get involved, but what's the first step?
Oh, we'd welcome that. Our website, as you mentioned earlier, is engagehope.org. We've got a Facebook page, and can email us, call us. The phone number is on the website, and we're available for anyone anytime to talk about what we're doing. And one easy way to get involved is someone just wanted to make just a one-time donation. With COVID and everything going on, we're facing emergencies there, just like, in the U.S., not diminishing things here, but we have been providing food, and we provide relief for malaria outbreaks, and 100% of all those donations that are designated for such things reach the purpose. We do not withhold one penny for administrative cost or otherwise. So every dollar goes for its intended purpose.
Well,
and again, our
yeah. Go ahead, because again, this is Engage Hope, and if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know some more, we have a link on the website, and that is sufficient enough. But Ken Stevens, thank you for reminding us of what is happening in other parts of the world, and thank you so very much for being willing to step out after that life-changing trip to Uganda back in 2011. And thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, Kerby, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we got a lot to cover. I think we'll probably get into a couple of these issues. What about NASCAR and Bubba Wallace? Got to talk about that just for a minute. I'm going to overdo that, but it tells you a little bit about the way in which media covers this and the way people jump to conclusions, which probably are not warranted. And then we'll get into a conversation with Dede Laugesen about the whole executive order that the president has put together, and the whole idea of international religious freedom. So we'll have kind of this international look a little bit later next hour, and then don't forget, in our third hour, Janelle Alberts and Ingrid Faro, honest answers, exploring God questions with your tween, and I think you're going to certainly appreciate that. My commentary today is called Anywheres and Somewheres, which is a very good piece that came out a while back at PragerU through the former Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, which I think, if nothing else, explained the rise of populism and the rise of the success, at least last time, of Donald Trump. Don't know if he'll be reelected. That's always a big question, but certainly it is, I think, a very insightful look at why some people have responded to some of the messages that have been out there, not just by the president, but also a number of other candidates. So we'll get into that as well. Don't forget that we are coming to the end of our fiscal year. That ends June 30th. And so we certainly would like to encourage you right now, even as we go to a break, to go to the website. There's a banner there that says, for such a time as this, give now. And again, at a time of uncertainty, which we've just been talking about quite a bit, people looking for answers, people wondering what's true, what isn't true. We'll be getting into that in just a few minutes in this NASCAR story. And that's why we hope that you'll consider what you might do to make a special gift to Point of View. And we are dependent upon your gifts to bring these programs to you. So if you would like to do so, we would greatly appreciate that as well. All sorts of material on the website today, including the one I mentioned just a little while ago in terms of the increased number of COVID-19 cases and increased number of just infections of the coronavirus. So we have that, as well as some other articles we're talking about, are all on the website. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
If you thought the first half of 2020 was newsworthy, can you even imagine what's coming in the next 6 months? Coronavirus, the economy, social unrest, and an election. One thing I know, Point of View plans to be here for every important event, and as June comes to a close, so does our fiscal year. God has provided, but we're still a long way from where we need to be prepared for this important time. As Kerby says in his most recent letter, both Point of View and you have been brought together for such a time as this. God always knows what we need to be prepared, and this is the time to ask yourself, what is my role? Do your part to strengthen God's people for the days to come. Make Point of View your megaphone for the stretch run of 2020. Visit pointofview.net/team and do what you can. Or call 1-800-347-5151. This is not a time where we can afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and over the next couple hours, we're going to be talking about a lot of different topics. So stay tuned and buckle up. We are certainly going to focus on, of course, a decision that came down from the appeals court in the District of Columbia, ordering the judge to dismiss the charges against Michael Flynn. I'll talk about that briefly. And it's not something we cover every day, but since it's in the news, that is the case. And then for you NASCAR fans, okay, we got to talk about Bubba Wallace, and we got to talk about the so-called noose and some of that, so we'll get into that as well. And then one of the most brazen acts by, in this case, the Democrats in the Senate, trying to prevent a bill by Republican Senator Tim Scott, a very good police reform bill, simply because they don't want maybe give victory to the issue of police reform to the Republicans, maybe because they're convinced that they're going to win the Senate. But at a time when all sorts of people are saying we've got some problems with policing in the country, I just really can't even believe it. So we'll get into those issues in about the first half. Then Dede Laugesen will be with us. We'll be talking about this executive order which promotes international religious freedom. So that will get us into some of those topics as well. A little bit later, I'll talk about my commentary that's aired today on Anywheres and Somewheres. And if that doesn't make a great deal of sense, it's based on a really interesting video, PragerU video, that was actually done by the former Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. And then we will, in the next hour, spend some time talking with Janelle Alberts and Ingrid Faro about their book, Honest Answers, Exploring God Questions with Your Tween. So we'll get a little bit into that issue of apologetics and raising your kids up correctly. So I think you'll enjoy some of the conversation here. But first story is one that the Federal Appeals Court in the district, this would be the D.C. Circuit Court, has actually ordered the judge in this particular case, U.S. District Judge Emmett Sullivan, to actually stop second-guessing the prosecutor's decision to drop the case and actually to drop the case. And if you're not familiar, we've talked about this before. I did a commentary back on May 26th, if you'd like to check it out, which I quote some great material from Alan Dershowitz, who, though he's a liberal, and though he believes that indeed some of the liberal ideas being presented by the court are good, he still has been very concerned about what is happening with some of these judges. And one of those, of course, we just mentioned, Emmett Sullivan, who, after both the prosecution and the defense agreed that the case should be dropped, that should be the end of it, right? Well, not necessarily for Judge Emmett Sullivan, because he decided not only was he not going to drop the case, he brought someone else to argue against it. Alan Dershowitz, I love it. He says, if nothing else, what we're starting to see is a court that is losing its constitutional authority to do anything after formally entering an order to end the case. That should be it. And the way he put it is, he said, not happy being umpires. They want to be commissioner of baseball. And so in some respects, this needed action that came from the panel today of the D.C. Circuit Court said, Judge, you've overstepped your bounds. This should be done with, and all the things that Michael Flynn, who is, of course, the former national security advisor for Donald Trump, has been through, should come to an end. You may say, I really don't care about this because I don't even know who he is, and it's not going to affect me. Well, just think about this. If you can have the kind of almost kangaroo trial that has been part of this, and accuse the national security advisor of things and put together what many people have called a perjury trap. They can do it for the sitting national security advisor for the president of the United States. They can do it to you. So we should be concerned about this. But let's talk NASCAR for just a minute. You've probably heard the story by now. There is Garage 4, and when Bubba Wallace is looking at this, one of his crew says, wait a minute, is that a noose, hangman's noose, hanging off of the garage here? And so, of course, you know what the rest of the story was, because this hangman's noose, in quotes, now we know a little bit more about it, was in the garage stall there at Talladega Superspeedway. And, of course, then the argument was this was done to get back at him, because if you're not familiar, he's the only African-American driver, at least in NASCAR's top level. And he successfully pushed just recently to actually get the stock car series to ban the Confederate flag. So the argument would be, well, this is a way to get back at him. Now, when I heard this, I thought, okay, there's one of three possibilities. Possibility number one is that there is some redneck out there that was going to actually try to intimidate him. That backfired, because as you saw, the entire number of drivers pushed Bubba Wallace's car to the starting line in a show of support. And that certainly didn't necessarily make sense. There was always the possibility that this is another one of those fake hate crimes. And if you think that those are very rare, you haven't been reading any of my Viewpoints commentaries, because about once a year, I just collect a few of the many fake hate crimes that are out there, not only done by African Americans, done by Muslims, done by homosexuals, and a number of others. So this is a possibility, Jesse Smollett type of thing. But what really kind of crossed my mind was, back when our garage, we have a garage right now that has a pulley system, but back when we had one where you pull it down, you would almost always wrap it a number of times so that you aren't just pulling on the string, you're pulling on something that has a little more texture to it. And it probably even could look like a noose, and it's quite possible somebody even did it just out of fun. But as the FBI came to investigate this, they said, look, that noose has been there since at least October. We got a picture. I've got it right in front of me here of that. And so it's been there at least that long, and there was no way anybody would have known that Bubba Wallace would have actually been assigned garage number 4. Which brings us to maybe the need for us to have some level of discernment, and that's what I really kind of want to talk about when we come back from the break, because in some respects, he reported what was there. I don't know how much he made a big deal out of it, but everybody else did make a big deal out of it. And it illustrates again why when you look at some of these stories that come out, you honestly just have to come to the conclusion that sometimes the press just gets out in front of themselves. But NASCAR's formal statement, I'll read that before we take a break. The FBI has completed its investigation at Talladega Superspeedway and determined that Bubba Wallace was not the target of a hate crime. The FBI report concludes, and photographic evidence confirms that the garage door rope fashioned like a noose has been positioned there since early as last fall. This was obviously well before the 43 team's arrival and garage assignment. We appreciate the FBI's quick and thorough investigation, are thankful to learn that this was not an intentional racist act against Bubba. We remain steadfast in our commitment to providing a welcoming and inclusive environment for all who love racing. So when we come back, just a short piece by Kira Davis, which, if nothing else, just as a reminder that when you hear a story and you're not sure about the story, sometimes the best thing to do is simply wait and find out whether you can get more information. And as a few people have said, there have been entirely too many commentators out there in front of their skis, skiing down the hill and tumbling because they just simply couldn't wait till more evidence came in. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll get into police reform, which is in the news and in Congress right now. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In a recent PragerU video, former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper talked about two different types of people. He described these two groups in order to explain why Donald Trump won in 2016. I'll ignore his explanation and conclusion in this short commentary in order to focus on the impact of two people groups. He says there are many people who can live anywhere and many more people who have to live somewhere. David Goodhart makes this important distinction in his book, The Road to Somewhere. He explains that this is a key fault line in Britain between the anywheres and the somewheres. Stephen Harper believes this explains the populace rising in many countries, including the United States. He says, imagine you work for an international bank, computer company, or consulting firm. You wake up in New York, London, or Singapore and feel at home. Your work is not threatened by import competition or technological dislocation. You're one of those who can live anywhere. This is not the case for those who are forced to live somewhere. He says, let's say you're a factory worker, a small business person, or in retail sales. If things go badly at your company or policy choices by politicians turn out to be wrong, you can't just shift your life to somewhere else. Turns out that the anywheres are not really that affected by outsourcing, labor, cheap labor, or even technological imports. The somewheres are affected by all of these things and have become angry when the elites in government, media, and business seem unconcerned about the disruptions that occur because of policies by government officials and decisions by multinational companies. That is why more and more somewheres are making their voice heard in elections and in the populist movement. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Bubba Watson in the news, and I don't really want to spend any more time so much talking about him as to how do you respond when you hear some of these stories. And the sad reality is I just went on our website here, and I think I have 10 different stories or commentaries I've written on fake hate crimes. Not that I'm trying to always talk about those, but they just surface with some regularity. And of course, Jesse Smollett has probably given us now a name that we can always associate with it. And so in the past, if somebody had what you thought might be a fake hate crime, you didn't dare say it out loud with Jesse Smollett, even when it happened. My wife was walking by the television set as that was being reported and says, that's incredible. I said, I wonder if it's true. But you don't dare say that out there because, well, then you just are not compassionate or you're denying that it's that racism exists. No, I'm just denying whether or not all these so-called hate crimes are really hate crimes. That's all I'm saying. And of course, here, if you denied that this was a news, well, then you're racist there as well. So you can't win, and sometimes you're just better not saying anything, which is why, for just a minute, before we go on, I wanted to go to Kira Davis. She said, if I've learned anything from my decade in this business, because she does commentaries, it is you don't run into a burning building holding a container full of gasoline. She says, watching cars go round and round in circles for hours seemed like an odd form of entertainment, so I really don't even know anything about NASCAR, but suddenly it became an apt metaphor for our current state of race relations as driven by the media. Because she said when the story first surfaced, I knew right away I had absolutely no intention of responding publicly until more details emerged. People always want opinions to be issued, but when you don't have all the facts, the opinions almost always are wrong. And she points out that sometimes in that first 24 to 48 hours of information, sometimes it's very unreliable. So again, you have this study which has come from the FBI, and the conclusion, looking at pictures and video, that has been there long before Bubba Watson ever showed up. So end of discussion. Nevertheless, then she still is a little bit disturbed by the young driver insisting to Don Lemon that despite the investigation, he still believes it was a noose and not a garage door pull, and realize it really isn't a story, and all the kinds of things that are said that. But anyway, the point that she is making is what she says I'm suggesting is that a story like this needs to be reported. I'm not saying you shouldn't report the story, but you shouldn't jump out with all sorts of opinions about the story unless some of the facts actually merit that. And again, we see that we instead, because you have, as she says, slumping cable news channels working to try to ratchet up any kind of concerns, anger, reaction, so that maybe they can get some sound bites, they can get some viewer eyes. This has really just sort of gotten out of hand. And she then concludes at the end, perhaps one of the greatest legacies President Trump will leave with us is this now commonplace term, fake news. She says everyone uses it, even the people who hate it. And we may not all agree on what it means, but we're all talking about that. And so, in a sense, what we find ourselves with is sometimes kind of a news cycle that doesn't inform us, but seems to be bent on inflaming us. And so here, whatever you think of the Bubba Wallace story, it certainly should at least leave you with a sense that maybe when I hear a story that seems maybe too good to be true, maybe when I hear a story about a hate crime, I'll wait to make sure it really was. And I think what you're going to find is that level of patience and discernment is going to serve you well. And so we'll do our best from time to time. And if you've noticed, I haven't said the name Bubba Wallace on this program because I just wanted to see, whether it would show up. And it did. And we found out. Let's go on, because I think there is some real need right now to do some police reform. Would you agree? I think there are outstanding majorities of Americans that believe that. Now, some believe that the reform is defund the police. That ain't happening. Well, I mean, indirectly it is, actually, because a lot of police officers are leaving the force. But there are some very concrete solutions, and I talked about some of those yesterday with the justice reform put forward by Republican Senator Tim Scott. If you would even want to think about criminal justice reform, this is a booklet we put out a while back, A Biblical View on Criminal Justice. Takes on the issues of crime and a variety of other issues. But today, the Wall Street Journal said Democrats are increasingly confident that they'll gain Senate control in November. And for evidence, watch how they handle Republican Senator Tim Scott's police reform bill this week. Democrats are signaling that they'll block the bill, even from moving to the floor for debate, much less for votes on amendments. As they said, this is cynicism squared. It can only mean that Democrats feel they'll pay no political price for obstruction. At a time right now when most Americans are saying, we need to do something, and we've given you lots of ideas. Qualified immunity needs to be revised, for sure. Looking at the police unions needs to be very significantly addressed, and we've talked about that. And I can give you a list of others, many of which, interestingly enough, are in this bill, things like chokeholds and no-knock warrants and a variety of other things. And so this is an attempt to try to move the local police departments towards better practices. I still think that most police officers on a day-to-day basis have done a good job, and the reason for that, saying that, is the fact that the best estimates are that people in law enforcement interact with the public about 375 million times. And you have to start thinking about those very few which result in actions. And as any profession, They're bad cops, just like they're good cops. There's bad teachers, like they're good teachers. Probably bad talk show hosts, like they're good talk shows. You go down the list. I mean, you know that. They're bad doctors, like they're good doctors. Bad lawyers, like they're good lawyers. So that is always going to be the case. So how do you weed out those so they do not do damage? And, of course, the big issue right now is to recognize that primarily policing is a really kind of a state, but mostly local issue. So the federal involvement in it is pretty narrow, but what it does is it uses money to leverage change. And so, again, they actually, through the federal government, contribute a little bit towards the police budgets. It's only about 6% in New York City, but the money can matter if it's tied to a desired policy. So, again, it is amazing to me right now, while Republican Senator Tim Scott, African-American, if you're not familiar, the only black Republican senator, only one of two African-Americans in the Senate, his police reform bill might go actually nowhere, simply because Democrats say, we can challenge it, we can block it, we don't want Republicans even taking credit for doing any kind of police reform, and besides, we're convinced that we're going to win the Senate, and so we will not even act on the issue that is sort of front and center right now before the American people. Hard to believe. Anyway, just before we take a break, and we're going to have Dede Laugesen on in just a few minutes, but I might just mention my commentary today is entitled Anywheres and Somewheres, and it really comes from a book that David Goodhart wrote, The Road to Somewhere, and this particular commentary is kind of based on a PragerU video done by the former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper about two kinds of people, and that is the first type are those people that can actually work anywhere. You could be working for an international bank. You could work for a computer company or a consulting firm. And he says you wake up in New York, London, Singapore, and feel at home. Your work is not threatened by import competition or technological dislocation. And so those are the anywheres. But, you know, most of us, we're the somewheres. You know, if you're a factory worker, a small business person, retail sales, if things go bad in your company or policy choices by your politicians turn out to be wrong, you just can't shift your life somewhere else. And so the argument he was making is while the anywheres were not really affected by the outsourcing of labor, cheap labor, even technological imports, the somewheres were affected by that. And a lot of those people ended up saying, you know, this guy, Donald Trump, candidate Donald Trump, don't really know all the things he believes in, but he certainly understands my world, which is being affected by jobs being sent overseas and by all sorts of regulations that are making it hard for me to make a living. And that was one of the appeals of Donald Trump back in 2016. How much it works this time in 2020, I do not know. But if nothing else, I wanted to post that commentary for you to see there are the differences between the anywheres and the somewheres. By the way, if you'd like to find some of the articles that we are talking about today, or if you would like to support this ministry, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. There's a banner there that says, for such a time as this, give now. And before the end of our fiscal year on June 30th, we would really love to hear from you. So if you can help us out financially, that will be the case. When we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about international religious freedom. All that coming up right after this.
Have you ever said, well, it can't get any worse than this? Here in 2020, I've stopped saying that. Just when you think difficulties have to end, it's something else. Never has there been a more important time to get good information about what's really happening in the nation and the world. And that means never has there been a more important time to jump on board the Point of View Truth Team. You have a critical role to play in stemming the tide of evil and participating in the cause for good. We have been called together for such a time as this, and all it takes is just a few minutes to visit our website or call us and join the team. Do that today. June is the end of our fiscal year, a time we're looking at what we can do in the second half of the year with so many big events ahead. And we really need to know that you are with us in the fight. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. We cannot afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to this program, you know that we've talked about a number of things from religious liberty to persecuted Christians. This particular half hour kind of pulls all of that together. And it has been kind of striking that this president, Donald Trump, has really kind of made it a priority of the issue of liberty. And we've talked about that, and we'll talk about it again on Friday with Kelly Shackelford of First Liberty. So we've seen that at home. We've also seen it internationally as well. And there was an executive order that came out about 3 weeks ago, a little less than 3 weeks ago, that actually begins to establish that. So I wanted to talk about that, talk about the plight of persecuted Christians, and just once again encourage you to not only pray about this, but recognize how that is an important issue as well during this campaign season. So we're going to talk with Dede Laugesen, who is the executive director and also the founding member of the Save the Persecuted Christians. We'll talk more about this organization, which is really addressing millions, about 327 million followers of Jesus Christ, and many of them facing extreme persecution worldwide. She is a Colorado native, a graduate of the University of Colorado at Boulder. Gosh, it's been years since I've spoken on that campus. And also the owner and manager of Wendover Media. Might also mention her husband is the editorial page editor of the Colorado Springs Gazette. And so, Dede, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's, if we can, talk about Save the Persecuted Christians. That's quite a grassroots movement. And tell our listeners a little bit more about how it formed and what is actually working on right now.
Save the Persecuted Christians, as you said, is a grassroots organization, but it's led by a coalition of leaders who, all in their own right, work to aid persecuted Christians, either directly or by reporting on them. And but they were finding that Americans simply don't know about the gravity of persecuted Christians around the world. And so we all came together in 2018 to form this coalition to more in a stronger way stand together and be able to promote these stories and advocate for strong policy that can really affect the lives and livelihoods of persecuted Christians and hold those who perpetrate these crimes against humanity accountable for their crime.
And again, what I understand is not only holding them accountable, imposing real costs and prosecution and all sorts of things which are there. So let's talk about this order. It was issued June 2nd, so that's about 3 weeks ago. And it is one that takes the ideas of protecting freedom of religion, both home and abroad, but especially abroad, and operationalizes them. So can you kind of talk about what that entails?
This is a full rounding out of President Trump's policy that he initiated from the very beginning, stated in his 2017 National Security Strategy that our founders understood religious freedom is not a creation of the state, but a gift from God. And he has been promoting this liberty in action since the beginning of his administration. This executive order signed on June 2nd is a fulfillment of that activity on behalf of the president to really protect and defend vigorously this, as he calls it, America's first freedom around the world in all of the policy and all of the activity that the U.S. government involves itself in, both internationally and domestically.
I might just mention that we have that on our website. You can go to whitehouse.gov and find it if you like, but we have it right there. So we have Advancing International Religious Freedom, and it's right under the picture of Dede. And, of course, you can also find out more about SaveThePersecutedChristians.org. So in some respects, we can talk about and pray for and be involved in our concern for those who are persecuted, but it does seem to me that there are some positive aspects of that. Foreign assistance and imposing sanctions. So talk about some of the specific ways, sometimes carrot, sometimes stick, that can actually bring about the kind of change necessary to help persecuted Christians.
Sure. Nina Shea with the Hudson Institute has said frequently that religious freedom has always been the orphan of our policies, foreign policy around the world. That it is for a very long time, with regards to U.S. policy, been neglected regarding human rights and our approach to how we interact with other countries, provide them aid, give them economic assistance. All of those things. Religious freedom is something that previous administrations have shied away from. But President Trump is elevating that as a national pillar regarding our foreign relations and also our domestic policy. He's mandating that all foreign officers who serve overseas are trained in religious freedom and religious issues, so that when they are in those countries, they are sensitive to and aware of the interplay of religious freedom with regards to how countries run their business. And he's also looking at ways that we truly can create costs for these perpetrators and impose sanctions and economic stressors onto these countries so that we can maybe encourage them to turn from their ways and to protect all the citizens in their lands and uphold that freedom of religion, which is protected in the UN Human Rights Declaration of Article 18, which says that all people have a right to express themselves according to their belief, to practice and worship freely. And all the countries who've joined into the UN have agreed to uphold human rights. But what we've found, and especially in a deteriorating fashion, more and more these rights are subjected to great oppression, and so it's time for this. President Trump spoke at the UN last year at the UN General Assembly. For the first time ever, a U.S. president spoke on religious freedom and made it known that this was a priority for the U.S. And if you are persecuting the people in your lands, or if you are allowing other entities to persecute people on behalf of their religion, then changes need to be made. And President Trump is taking a very strong stand on that, and we're very happy to hear it.
Again, we have that particular executive order, which is on the website. Let's, if we can, Dede Laugesen, again on the program with us, talk about the organization Save the Persecuted Christians.org, because that is something that you have actually founded. You're the executive director of it, and it seems to me that when we are wanting to do what we can to help persecuted Christians, I think you have some very concrete steps on things that we can actually do to help persecuted Christians. What might those be?
So we have nearly 200 coalition members, as I said, leading this grassroots organization, and thousands of Americans and other people around the world who've joined in to really elevate the stories of these brothers and sisters who are so sorely aggrieved in the world. There are 327 million persecuted Christians. That's one for every man, woman, and child in the United States of America. 260 million of those are heavily persecuted. They wake up every day and don't know if they're going to make it through the day. Their children are kidnapped from their homes and forcibly married off and converted. Their properties are stolen from them. They're left out of civil life. They face rape and torture and murder, even on a genocidal scale, in a record number of countries around the world. One of the things that Save the Persecuted Christians does is we run a news aggregator at ChristianPersecutionNews.com, where you can go and we try to pull together as many stories on persecuted Christians as we can and make them easily available both to the public and also to the media, so that it's a real good source of where you can come and find all the reports that have to do with persecution around the world and also see these stories. So it pulls it all together for you. It's a very easy resource.
Let me take a break, and then I want to come back because we have one of those mandatory breaks, but I want to talk about some of the other resources you have, because there's some great things that people can find at SaveThePersecutedChristians.org, and we'll continue right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have with us for just a few more minutes, Dede Laugesen, and she again is the executive director and founding member of Save the Persecuted Christians. And Dede, just a minute ago, you were talking about something that people can find by going to our website or going directly to yours, Christian Persecution News, which I think is a great resource. It's kind of a who's who of a lot of people we've had on the program here that have addressed many of those issues. So that's one of the many resources which I would encourage people to get a copy of. But you have various resources and various initiatives. And since we have a lot of activists right now, there are just a couple of things that you are encouraging some of our listeners to do. First of all, we're educating them about this executive order, but you're also talking about trying to appoint a presidential envoy for Nigeria, for example, and then there are all sorts of ways in which you can get information in cards and things like that thought that you might put in your church bulletin or pass around at your political meeting. So talk about some of the resources that people will find at savethepersecutedchristians.org.
You're right, Kerby. We have many different ways that people can get involved. First and foremost, we'd love for people to go to savethepersecutedchristians.org and send a letter to your member of Congress and to President Trump asking for the appointment of a U.S. Special Envoy to Nigeria. Nigeria is experiencing a genocide, and this genocide has the potential to explode into something on par with that of Rwanda or the Sudan. We need to break the shameful silence that exists around what is happening in Nigeria to the Christians there. There is a jihad being waged from top down. So you have a government that is heavily lopsided towards Muslims. President Buhari himself is a Fulani Muslim. The Fulani herdsmen in Nigeria are regularly, daily attacking Christian farming communities in the Middle Belt. And you also have Boko Haram, one of the world's most dangerous terrorist organizations, which has exacted incredible harm upon Christians in northern Nigeria. Both of these groups and others, including Al-Qaeda, are active in Nigeria, and the government, in all respects, seems to be complicit in supporting this jihad that is being waged. It is a sensitive subject, and it is a place of conflict at the State Department. You have people who are deeply embedded in the State Department who do not want to address violence by Muslims towards Christians. But when you look at the Open Doors 2020 World Watch list, you find that the majority of the countries where Christians are being persecuted are Islamic republics, and the cause for their persecution is Islam and Sharia supremacy. So Christians are being gravely harmed, and these embedded people at the State Department and other agencies in the U.S. government continue to refuse to acknowledge the radical nature of so many of these states and entities that are causing harm to our brothers and sisters and to others. Where religious freedom is oppressed, you do not have prosperity, you do not have economic freedom. It affects society across the board. Also, at Save the Persecuted Christians, we have resources. We are modeled on a campaign from the 1970s through the 80s where Soviet Jews were put into the gulags, and you had a college group here in the United States concerned about them who started sending out banners called Save Soviet Jewry that were placed outside of houses of worship and synagogues all over the United States. It became so popular, even President Trump had a bracelet on his desk to save Soviet Jewry. This whole campaign provided the popular support that President Reagan needed in order to enforce economic sanctions on the Soviet Union, which eventually brought that evil empire down. In like respect, Save the Persecuted Christians started with a banner campaign, and churches and houses of worship can order a banner, Save the Persecuted Christians banner, from us that they can place outside of their house of worship to just really alert their congregations to the problem of persecution around the world. And that what comes with that is an educational packet. You can get posters and palm cards and other things to put into your bulletin, as you said, at Save the Persecuted Christians. All of those resources are available. We also regularly send out requests for people to sign on to open letters. We work with all of these different groups to encourage the administration or members of Congress to enact policy that can help alleviate the pain that they are suffering. And so these open letters are invitations for the grassroots to get involved and to make their voices heard.
And again, all of that material is available at savethepersecutedchristians.org. Let me encourage some of you in a church to maybe get one of those banners. We've talked about that before. Also, you can even host a traveling exhibit about people of the cross. And if you wanted to have a missions outreach or focus on a Sunday to pray for the persecuted Christians, that would be the case. So you can find all sorts of great resources at, again, savethepersecutedchristians.org. And so we have that link. And, of course, we have the link to the executive order by the president promoting international religious freedom. So, Dede, I appreciate you being on the program with us today, and thank you for founding the organization and educating us about something that we probably wouldn't know about if you hadn't come on the program with us today.
My pleasure, Kerby. Thanks so much.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, I'll get into a couple of issues in the news, especially a couple of things having to do with, you're supposed to wear a mask. Except when you're not supposed to wear a mask. What? And so we'll get into that. Some interesting policies that have been implemented just recently when we talk about the coronavirus. And then we'll get into a very good book, which I think you will enjoy, especially if you have young teenagers, which is usually, if you do, the people that are asking all sorts of questions. The book is entitled Honest Answers, Exploring God Questions with Your Tween. And I think you'll enjoy that conversation as well. And, of course, we always are dedicated to doing what we can to address some of these issues of apologetics and news and information as well. So we've covered quite the gamut, but we have a lot more to cover in just a few minutes. And don't forget, my Viewpoints commentary today is on anywheres and somewheres, which I think really gave a good explanation for why sometimes this populist message is resonating with individuals that say, I have to be in this factory, I have to be in this small business, so I am at the mercy of regulators, I'm at the mercy of decisions that affect me, and the people that live in the anywheres, well, they can just simply move their office somewhere else or live somewhere else and not be affected by that. So that is, I think, a very insightful commentary that came from the former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And as you go to the website and find some of these articles, some of these books, some of these resources, hope that you'll also remember that, of course, we depend on your financial gifts to continue this program every single day. We have less than a week before the end of our fiscal year, so it's time to hear from you. And if you can do anything to help us out, that would be greatly appreciated. All available at the website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about masks and policies, which are all over the map on those today, even at a time when we are finding out more and more that masks really do help. And if we're going to try to prevent getting a second lockdown, which unfortunately there are quite a number of people talking about now, especially in positions of authority, let's get into that briefly before we get into a whole conversation about how to talk about God and theology and the Bible with our kids. So all that coming up next hour, right after these important messages.
If you thought the first half of 2020 was newsworthy, can you even imagine what's coming in the next 6 months? Coronavirus, the economy, social unrest, and an election. One thing I know, Point of View plans to be here for every important event, and as June comes to a close, so does our fiscal year. God has provided, but we're still a long way from where we need to be prepared for this important time. As Kerby says in his most recent letter, both Point of View and you have been brought together for such a time as this. God always knows what we need to be prepared, and this is the time to ask yourself, what is my role? Do your part to strengthen God's people for the days to come. Make Point of View your megaphone for the stretch run of 2020. Visit pointofview.net/team and do what you can. Or call 1-800-347-5151. This is not a time where we can afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about masks and, again, the push for maybe a second lockdown and travel advisories, which have just now been an issue that could affect all of us. And I'll just use my own state, since we're broadcasting from the state of Texas for the moment, that yesterday the state of Texas had more than 5,000 new cases, which makes kind of Texas now a hot spot. And you've had the governor, in this case, Greg Abbott, warning that if anything, we've got to change and to turn around the rampant spread of the coronavirus. Well, he's not the only governor issuing statements, because now you have the New York governor, Andrew Cuomo, who is actually saying that New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey will require visitors from states with high infection rates to quarantine for 14 days. Okay. States that are over that threshold are you ready for this? Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Washington, Utah, and Texas. Okay, try that one. I'm supposed to be speaking at a Labor Day camp in upstate New York, in obviously near Labor Day, late August. If this is implemented, I would have to go up, 2 weeks early? Then be quarantined for 14 days before then I would be allowed to speak at that camp. Think that through for just a minute. A couple of weeks from now, I was supposed to have spoken at Word of Life in upstate New York, which is Schroon Lake, but that one was canceled because of coronavirus, and who knows what will happen in the future. But if this is implemented, you can see that even if indeed there isn't a lockdown, when you start issuing travel advisories between states, you're in a whole different ball game in terms of what could happen in the future. So that also brings us back to a topic we've addressed many times on this program, but it's worth mentioning again, and that is the value of actually wearing a mask. And we've been told by our health officials that wearing a mask is important, and we should wear a mask except when we aren't supposed to wear a mask. And you know what I'm going to say, and that is that we've had some situations where when you were going to maybe protest one of the government lockdowns, exercising your First Amendment rights, you were told that you were endangering individuals. But if you were going to protest, legitimately so, the death of George Floyd, protest racism in America, protest the police, whatever it might be, no problem there. And so you can see that oftentimes our leaders have some really different kinds of philosophies about wearing a mask, depending on whether they agree or disagree with your particular political stance. Well, here's the latest one. If you have not heard this out of Oregon, I am not making this up. You would think that this is something that was a jest, but it is not. Because we've now found that in some cases, science has to give way to social justice, and social justice can then justify that certain people of certain backgrounds have to wear a mask, but certain individuals of other backgrounds don't have to wear a mask. The lesson comes from Oregon County. We're talking about Lincoln County. I know exactly where that is in Oregon, where the directive requiring all residents ages 12 and over to wear masks in indoor settings outside the home or outdoors when they will be near people. But there's one very glaring exception. This particular directive issued by the Health Department of Lincoln County in Oregon specifically exempts non-Caucasians referred to as people of color. Now, you can imagine that people going, wait, okay, if you're white, you wear a mask. But if you're Hispanic or black, you don't wear a mask? Is that what you're saying? And the argument is that because of their concerns about the possibility of racial profiling, or maybe even harassment due to wearing a mask, only the individuals that have less melanin in their skin pigment have to wear a mask. That's right. I mean, you just can't even make this stuff up. I don't think it's going to last very long. If nothing else, there's this real troublesome thing called the Constitution. And in the Constitution, there's the thing known as the Equal Protection Clause. You can't say I'm going to have one set of laws for one individual and different set of laws for different individuals when there's no meaningful difference between those two individuals. And, of course, this has led to all sorts of Twitter comments. Attention, county commissioners of Lincoln County, Oregon, you have hired crazy people to work for you. One wants to know, well, how much color gets you the no mask pass? In other words, if I got a little more melanin, if I'm kind of over a light brown, is that enough? Well, where's that put me? And then, of course, I love this. So wearing a mask is selfish because you kill grandma, but killing grandma is fine as long as grandma is black. I don't think they're going to like where that one takes. And one of the Twitter posts just simply says, science, which is not. And in case you haven't read some of the articles we've posted, this one in the Washington Post really is a good summary. We posted it last week, as a matter of fact. And it talks about the fact that in probably the broadest review so far, published in the journal Lancet, which is kind of the medical journal of record for the UK, they concluded data from 172 observational studies indicating that wearing face masks reduces the risk of the coronavirus infection. Now, they do, in the particular statement there, say we have low certainty of it because really the gold standard, as I've talked about on this program before in science, is a randomized double-blind controlled trial, which is really impossible to do in any kind of pandemic. But you have all sorts of individuals from different groups and research areas, one at Columbia University, saying it appears that face mask use is an important control against multiple modes of SARS-CoV-2 transmission. And so you have that. You have some of the studies that have come, this is now from a different article, best way to reduce coronavirus transmission is by wearing a face mask. This is a team of researchers from Texas and California, which includes a number of fairly prestigious universities there as well. Texas A&M, University of Texas, University of California at San Diego, California Institute for Technology, which also find that wearing face masks in public corresponds to the most effective means to prevent interhuman transmission. And so then they've actually gone back and even looked at Wuhan, China, Italy, and New York City. And one that I think is kind of interesting, this study here, face masks can reduce coronavirus transmission by up to 75% because, okay, we can't really do a double-blind study with humans, but we can do it with animals. And so by putting these various masks between those which were injected with the COVID-19 and those which were not, they, using animal studies, were able to document that as well. So anyway, the point is that we have, at a time when we probably have more and more studies showing that face masks work, we have a good number of individuals say, I'm not going to wear them because I just don't want to wear them. And then we have others that say, well, it's not that important to wear them if you're actually marching for social justice. Or it's not really important for you to wear them if indeed you're a person of color. At least that comes out of Lincoln County in Oregon, which once again just illustrates a point we've made before. Face masks are important, except when they're not important. And it probably has not helped that the Surgeon General and even Anthony Fauci and others have said contradictory things about masks at a time when we obviously recognize that they do some good, and yet a lot of people simply won't wear them anyway. And in many cases don't have to because of various kinds of policies. Anyway, let's take a break. We're going to get back and talk about honest answers for your tween right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In a recent PragerU video, former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper talked about two different types of people. He described these two groups in order to explain why Donald Trump won in 2016. I'll ignore his explanation and conclusion in this short commentary in order to focus on the impact of two people groups. He says there are many people who can live anywhere and many more people who have to live somewhere. David Goodhart makes this important distinction in his book, The Road to Somewhere. He explains that this is a key fault line in Britain between the anywheres and the somewheres. Stephen Harper believes this explains the populace rising in many countries, including the United States. He says, imagine you work for an international bank, computer company, or consulting firm. You wake up in New York, London, or Singapore and feel at home. Your work is not threatened by import competition or technological dislocation. You're one of those who can live anywhere. This is not the case for those who are forced to live somewhere. He says, let's say you're a factory worker, a small business person, or in retail sales. If things go badly at your company or policy choices by politicians turn out to be wrong, you can't just shift your life to somewhere else. Turns out that the anywheres are not really that affected by outsourcing, labor, cheap labor, or even technological imports. The somewheres are affected by all of these things and have become angry when the elites in government, media, and business seem unconcerned about the disruptions that occur because of policies by government officials and decisions by multinational companies. That is why more and more somewheres are making their voice heard in elections and in the populist movement. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you've ever listened to Point of View, you know that we certainly do like to talk about the area of apologetics. We want to help you articulate a biblical worldview, but also know how to defend it. And I have found that the younger they are, the more likely they are to ask some really significant questions. When I joined a ministry more than 40 years ago, most of those questions were being asked on the college campus, but we also started seeing some of the questions about their faith and everything being asked even in the high schools. But we've talked about this with a variety of people like Ken Ham and Britt Beamer and others that their book Already Gone says that really when they're even in their middle school years, the tweens are asking fundamental questions about God, about the Bible, about Jesus Christ. And so that's why I was just thrilled to see this book, Honest Answers, Exploring God Questions with Your Tween. And it is written by two individuals that are joining me now by phone. Janelle Alberts is actually an individual that spent her early career in the PR departments of Microsoft and UPS and has really been able to write quite a bit. Wrote her first faith column for the Akron Beacon, and you might have seen some of her pieces on Christianity Today's Gifted for Leadership or the Relevant magazine, and joins us now from Ohio by phone. So, Janelle, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And then also let me introduce the other co-author, and that is Dr. Ingrid Faro, who's the Dean of Academic Affairs and Associate Professor of Old Testament at Northern Seminary. She's also an Associate Professor of Old Testament at the Scandinavian School of Theology in Sweden, has her master's degree and PhD from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and joins me now by phone from Illinois.
Hello, Kerby. Thank you.
Ingrid, let me come to you for just a minute. Can you give us a little bit of the history of this background? Because, of course, you teach in a seminary, so you recognize that you're already trying to provide these answers for those individuals that maybe are 20-somethings. But I'm here to tell you, by the time they're about 12 or 13, they're already asking the same kind of questions, aren't they?
Absolutely, and that is one of the reasons I was excited to join Janelle in this project, having kids my own, and of course some of the students having kids of their own, and just in church and so forth, finding out kids do ask a lot of very deep questions very young. They have lots of challenges.
You know, and Janelle, you think about your kids and, you know, Jesus loves me, this I know. The kids love the Bible stories and everything. But part of the problem is that they hear them as stories and they think, well, they're kind of like dragons or it's kind of like Harry Potter. And so very quickly you have to get back to helping them understand that the Bible is true. And those young kids that just believed everything that you taught them in Sunday school and at home, all of a sudden, by the time they get into the tween years, they start asking really difficult questions, don't they?
Absolutely. And they are, like you're saying, similar to what they were asking when they were younger, but they have these influences, like now they're in school and they've heard about Cleopatra, Alexander the Great, and they think, well, is Jesus real? I mean, they know Jesus is real the way we've told them Jesus is real, but what they're really wanting to know is he real like those people that I'm hearing about in school?
Yes, and again, that is the problem. Ingrid, I was just thinking about this. You know, the first section here is, what does the Bible tells me so really mean? When you have, let's just pick Bart Ehrman as an example, traveling around on various colleges' campuses, or people that, and young people that maybe go to a YouTube channel or watch a TV show, very quickly they go, I don't really even know whether or not I believe the Bible. So really, almost instantaneously, you have to address this issue of biblical authority, don't you?
Absolutely, and when we can address it young, because the challenges come in grade school, and often parents either aren't aware of it or aren't prepared to start handling those questions. So if we can start training them young that they're going to be challenging questions, but they're excellent answers, and that the Scripture is reliable, and here are the reasons why.
And again, I want to dig into some of those, but I thought maybe for just a minute, Janelle, tell us how the book's put together, because you've got 4 sections, and then you've got kind of a question-answer format in some sections of that. So it's great for a parent to go through this, but I was also thinking the way this is put together for some of our listeners that are saying, you know, I have to teach these middle schoolers in church, this might be a great book for that as well. So talk about how you can use the book.
Yeah, it's a good resource for all of those. We set it up in 4 sections. Like you were talking about there, we talk about the Bible. We also talk about church. We talk about faith and science. And then we also talk about prayer. And we break it down so that, just as you're saying, you try to tackle these kinds of things with older kids, but then you say, like my friends and I said, we'll be ready. We're going to be the parents who, when our kids come to us and ask us a tough question, we're going to be open, can't wait. And then when the time came, we just thought, I don't know what to say. I'm actually not very good at this. Or even if we did know, we didn't know how to say it in 140 characters or less, you know, tweak size or, you know, in a bite-sized bit so that our kids could sort of grasp it. So we break it down in that way. We give the parents some cheat sheets and maybe 1, 2, 3 pages to give you a quick overview, brush up, and then we break down some Q&A. So what we also found is even if we have a bit of a brush up and then we come before the kids and try to do a Q&A, it's cricket. And so we set up the Q&A so everybody's reading, engaging, nobody's on the hook for sharing their deep feelings or what happened in the back of the bus that they're not sure mom and dad even want to hear about today. It's very laid out, very friendly, but it gets down to the nitty-gritty pretty quick.
Well, and again, that's the kind of thing that you would want to have. But again, trying to even have a family devotional for the young and restless is always difficult. And trying to keep people's focused and all that is something that's a little bit much. But the way you have it, you have some sections, some questions, so you can ask a question and they have participation. So just real quickly, maybe just before I take a break, either one of you, but I'll maybe try Ingrid. What would we want to tell young people, tweens, about the Bible? Because that's, I think, once you get that one kind of organized, some of the rest falls into place pretty easily, doesn't it?
It does, and there's some basic information as far as how did we get the Bible, and especially now with all the archaeology and all the discoveries, there's a lot of solid information. The fact that there are more fragments and pieces of the New Testament by far than any other piece of ancient writing, and it just goes on and on. So we provide some solid information that kids and parents can hold on to and say, oh, and usually the parents didn't know, or as you said, sometimes it can be Sunday school teachers and other people who are engaging with the middle school children and middle school kids. So we provide some solid information. The reputation among scholars, even among scholars who aren't Christians, nevertheless recognize that there are some solid facts here. And so we work with that and just giving some information and then just building on that from there, that relationship with God as well as with the Scripture.
I love that part, too, about the Bible's reputation among scholars, because I have noticed with young people, matter of fact, this week even our Mind Games camp is taking place, and we've been talking about Summit Ministries and a variety of others. They have these individuals that say, you know, Mom and Dad, they seem real sincere. My pastor, he seems like he's a real nice person, but now I'm in the presence of individuals on a university campus, and they have their PhD, and they're scholars. And so as much as I kind of appreciate my parents' faith or my pastor's faith, these are the scholars. And so I thought it was really good that you put in a few scholars to say, look, these are individuals that have academic credentials equal to, if not superior to, some of the ones that seem to be a little bit bent on trying to destroy your faith. So it's just good to know that is the case. So let's take a break. And when we come back after the break, we'll spend some time looking at a couple of the other sections in this book called Honest Answers. It is published by our good friends at Kriegel, and you probably should be able to find it. But as always, we've made it very easy for you simply to go to the website at pointofview.net. And if you click on that, then you will see that the book has been out a couple months, and you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. And you may want to get more than just one if you have more than one tween, but I suspect some of you listening right now say, you know, I'm teaching these middle school or kids, and I don't sometimes know what to say, and I don't know how to answer some of their questions. I think you might not only want to get a copy of the book for you, but for every one of the individuals in the class. And the sections, of course, deal with the Bible, prayer, and then if God made the world, what's my science teacher talking about? That whole issue of faith and science, very important. And then the whole issue of what is church supposed to look like? And so I think you'll appreciate the conversation that we'll be having. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to get a copy of the book, of course, we've made it very easy for you to find there as well. In addition to that, of course, we have the links to the two guests that we have on the program here today so that you can maybe interact with them if you would like to ask additional questions or read some of the material that they have written in other formats. It's all available at our website, pointofview.net. As you go to pointofview.net, I hope you also remember that we're just a week away from the end of our fiscal year, and if you can help us out financially, we would greatly appreciate it. We'll continue talking about honest answers, exploring God questions with your tween, right after this.
Have you ever said, well, it can't get any worse than this? Here in 2020, I've stopped saying that. Just when you think difficulties have to end, it's something else. Never has there been a more important time to get good information about what's really happening in the nation and the world. And that means never has there been a more important time to jump on board the Point of View Truth Team. You have a critical role to play in stemming the tide of evil and participating in the cause for good. We have been called together for such a time as this, and all it takes is just a few minutes to visit our website or call us and join the team. Do that today. June is the end of our fiscal year, a time we're looking at what we can do in the second half of the year with so many big events ahead. And we really need to know that you are with us in the fight. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. We cannot afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
2.5 hours, we talk about this book, Honest Answers, Exploring God Questions with Your Tween. Janelle and Ingrid with us today, the co-authors of this book. And I thought we might focus on this issue of science, because if you look at Unchristian, written by Dave Kinnaman, or you even look at the book Ex-Christians, there are oftentimes interviews done with, for example, young people, why they did not become a Christian, or in other cases, they were Christians and grew up in a Christian family and left Christianity. One theme that shows up a little too often is, well, I'm a Christian, but I'm interested in science, and I was told that either you accept the Bible or science. You can't accept both, so I got rid of the Bible. And so in some respects, it relates very much to this section, Ingrid. If God made the world, what's my science teacher talking about? And by the time you get into middle school, you're already starting to say, I know what I heard in church, but I'm not hearing that in my biology class or my physics or chemistry class. So how do we start dealing with that very contentious issue?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that since God created the world, he created science. And so that's a great starting point for everybody, actually, and that we need to have the conversations. We don't know it all. The Bible is not specifically a science book, but yet God is the one who created it all. So it's important to allow the questions to be asked, but still say, well, let's look at Scripture. And so often throughout Christian history, there have been conflicts from time to time between science and faith. And sometimes the faith community has fallen on the wrong side of science, where it turns out it didn't really contradict Scripture, but it was tradition. So it's also important to be able to ask questions. Most important thing, let's have the conversations and recognize that God is the one who created all these laws of the universe. We simply try to figure out how to use them and how they apply. So starting there is a great place, and not shutting them down, not shutting down the questions, but exploring them and taking them sort of down the line and seeing where they lead, but then going back to Scripture, because Scripture and science, the more I study it, the more I find beautiful correspondence between the two.
Janelle, one of the questions that I'm sure the typical parent gets is, we were reading about Jonah. Now, that's kind of a whale of a tale. Do we as Christians really believe this? And in some respects, it can put you on your heels almost instantaneously, can't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, this is where we have to do what you were describing earlier, which is we care about scholars. It's very interesting to us what scholars have to say about these kinds of things. And so even for what you had said earlier, Bart Ehrman maybe saying some things about the Bible isn't true. If we can come to the table, Bart Ehrman himself says Jesus is the most documented person at the time in that area of time of history. So we can use the same kinds of conversations around very specific scientific questions. But our best shot really is to kind of start giving our kids a gist of why it's so contentious in the first place. Mm-hmm. And first off, it's, scholars who maybe began to preach the gospel of science instead of the gospel of Jesus. And that's not always the case. And so for our kids to begin to, we really want to just sort of arm them with the skill of proceed less in fear and more in, I'll assess what's in front of me here. Let's think about this rather than this throws me off.
It does seem to me that some of the material that you have in here, Stephen Meyer, for example, that we've interviewed on this program, right. I've known him for decades now, and other individuals that are speaking to that certainly are providing an abundance of evidence. But at the same time, we've got Richard Dawkins and all our, new atheist friends out there. So it does seem to me that we just need to prepare them for the fact that they're going to hear contradictory ideas, and they need to actually have some level of discernment. Maybe develop in their minds a baloney detector and figure out that some of the things being said aren't really scientifically true, especially when every time we turn around, somebody said, well, believe the science. Well, that can lead you all sorts of different directions, can't it?
Absolutely.
Well, and plus, and even in the book we talk about Dawkins, and he's talking with another atheist who is still an atheist, but he has come to believe some things that are different than talking. So even for our kids to know, look, there's a lot of conversations happening here, and here's how we approach things that we don't know. We look at it, we assess it. It doesn't necessarily mean the folks on the science side of the street have their act all together, and the folks on the faith side of the street have their act in this one certain way. It all requires, let's look at it and talk about it. Let's talk about it together. The key is that if we as parents, when they come to us with questions, we don't panic. We have, a couple of tidbits that are legitimate answers to their questions, and answer everything, answer something, that they begin to think, I'll come back to this. I'll come back to this source. My parents, they know something. They might not know everything. They know something, though. They've done some homework. And when you begin to do that at home, that makes it a lot easier for them to do it outside of the home.
Very good. And again, that's part of it, is that you don't even have to say, look, I have all the answers, but we'll work on them together. And the good news is there's so many great books written, including this one, and there's so many great ways in which you can do a Google search and find answers that that is good. Let me keep it going, because one of the other chapters dealt with church. And you got a couple of issues here. What is church? Why do I need to go to church? Why do we have all these different denominations? If the Bible's true, why all these denominations? Maybe that's a good one to start with. Can either of you kind of help us figure out how to answer that oftentimes very contentious question?
Ingrid, I'll let you tackle that.
Okay, I'll dig in here. Yeah, it's a great question, because we know originally there was just one church, and we know when Christ comes back there will also be one church. So what's happened in between then and now? And so it's again, it's the communication, talking with the kids, and recognizing that there have been politics sometimes came into the church. There have been power plays and things like that. People have never been perfect. God only has, other than Jesus coming, everyone else is broken, and we can express our brokenness in different ways. And but every part of the church, just like every part of the body, the human body, has a different role and different function. And so Paul says so well, is the eye going to be mad at the hand, or the hand mad at the ear, and so forth, and saying, why don't you look like me? So some of it is just saying, let's look and see what can we appreciate about the differences, but let's also see what we have that's the same. And so just helping answer the questions and tear down some of the us versus them rhetoric that they've become so often that they've been hearing. And but it also requires us to be looking at others, because certainly with all the things happening in our culture, the church we need to be coming together with other believers and setting aside some of our differences to hold up what is the key of the gospel. And certainly love is the first, Christ dying for our sins. Let's focus on the first things and recognize we've all got problems, and the church has always had problems as well, because there are people in it. So that's a start.
Janelle, let me come to you for just a minute, because I thought another issue that oftentimes tends to peel young people off of the church is a bad experience in the church. Either they weren't treated well by some of the other kids in the youth group, or they saw hypocrisy on the part of some of the leadership, or those kinds of things. So that section of your book is really important, because lots of times it isn't that they leave the church because of deep philosophical or theological concerns. Sometimes they leave it because it just doesn't seem relevant to them, or it seems like it's full of hypocritical people.
Yes, I know, and it's so painful when this happens inside the church, but it happens because we are on earth. It doesn't happen because we're in a particular group. So when our kids have these kind of conversations with us and realize pain is part of the human condition, and that when you are in a church environment, that is a group of, it's a human environment. But when we can keep educating them on what it is meant to be, and they are part of a centuries strong entity, and point to, Christianity just does not happen in a vacuum. And so we can point to Christians who were not unkind, and Christians who stood up in ways that, can make our kids feel not alone. And again, back to the scholars, I mean, non-believing scholars will say where this notion of human dignity, where the preciousness of individual humans comes from is from Scripture, from our Scriptures. So when they begin to see, look, this is the origination of something, no matter what literature you're looking at, no matter what worldview you're looking at, even non-believers are pointing to this for, standing up for the marginalized and for people who are, made in the image of God. These things kind of resonate with our kids if over time.
Sure. Let me take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes as we talk about the book Honest Answers. It is available in your local bookstore, but we have a link so that you can get it in paperback or Kindle. And we're talking with Janelle and Ingrid. And I thought, the section on prayer really has kind of a theme, perseverance, tenacity, because you have a section here on sticking with prayer, even when circumstances say not to, and picking God and sticking with Him. And that's a kind of an issue as well. We want to develop, again, Janelle and Ingrid, some kind of patterns in the lives of our young people that hopefully will stand them in good stead through the rest of their lives. And so that has to do with prayer and Bible study, maybe devotional time, evangelism. Talk about what, again, you want to try to accomplish in that section.
Well, and actually the section that's gotten the most attention because I think all of us, no matter our age, this idea of prayer, we long for that connection with God, and it offers so much, and yet we don't break it down. And so that's what we do in the book. We break it down. We use Corrie ten Boom as an example. She saved her neighbors from the Nazis. We talk in the book about prayer is a lot more about building a relationship with God more than just asking for stuff, but also Corrie ten Boom asked for stuff. So prayer is engaging with God and longing for intervention, and Corrie ten Boom experienced intervention, and the war raged on. So two things, dichotomous things, can be happening at the same time, and that's real life. So when you talk about people who leave the faith, pursuing a different worldview, what you constantly come back to is this is the most comprehensive understanding of what life is like here. It is dichotomous, but that's what we break down for the kids so that they can think about really how to break this down is what I just described. And then after that, it's practice. It's just practice.
Ingrid, any additional comments on that?
Yeah, it's so important to learn and to let kids know that suffering and pain is part of life, and that even as Christians, with God who loves us so much that he gave his only son still allows us to have suffering and experience pain in this life. But to recognize the important thing is that God is with us in it and through it, and God wants to show us and help us through these things in life. He doesn't always shield us. Sometimes he does. But it's building that relationship with God, as Janelle said, too, and it's that engagement with God, and that's what we try to bring it to, and that's why we bring in stories of people who did suffer, who have gone through hardship, but yet look what God did in their life, and look at the relationship with God that they developed and what God did in and through those very things. So that's just a little bit more, just prayer being that relationship with God, not just asking for stuff, even though that's part of it, but it's so much more.
Janelle, just before we run out of time, let's talk about how people can use this book. Now, again, a typical parent could say, this is what I want to maybe start putting together for maybe a teaching time with my kids, or maybe I get 2 copies and my tween reads one and we read the 2 together, or it does seem to me that this could be used in a teaching format. So talk about how you can use the book.
Basically, if you're going to do it within a family, it is this idea, this is what we do here. We've got an environment in which we talk about stuff. So you got a question, we're going to talk about that. And our parent answers, we commit, we're going to be quick. There's going to be a tangible. We've got some, tidbits for you. And we're all going to be willing to kind of dig and grow. And if we dig into this book, maybe once a week, we do it 10, 15 minutes, and then maybe we don't. Lacrosse season happens, basketball season comes up, everybody gets busy. We'll pick it up again in the spring, and that's how you can use the book. Any other suggestions there, Ingrid?
I think also for youth leaders and just people who perhaps aren't parents or maybe mentoring. Often we see more and more of people who are mentoring a young person or stepping into their lives in various ways. So pretty much anybody who encounters and has regular encounters with the tween, that's maybe helpful if they have a role in teaching them, training them, encouraging them, and mentoring them.
I might just mention, too, if people would want to contact you or find out more about the seminary where you teach and those kinds of things, we have that link there as well. And also for Janelle, we have your link so that people can find some of your writing and those kinds of things. And I would suggest that if somebody is putting together maybe some kind of Christian education program or a kickoff for the fall in terms of Sunday school, maybe they could invite either or both of you to come and speak and promote the book, because I just think it'd be a great resource for a lot of these churches wanting to make sure that we reach young people at that age, at that time, answering their questions so they'll be confident in their faith. So I really appreciate both of you joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Again, one last time, the book is entitled Honest Answers, Exploring God Questions with Your Tween, and it is published by our friends at Kriegel, so you probably should be able to find it in your local bookstore. It's been out for a couple months, so it might be there, but if not, of course, we always have a link, and that is in both paperback and in Kindle, and I think you're going to find that very helpful. Let me just, before we run out of time here, mention that we have talked about a number of different topics over the last 2 hours here today, and if you find yourself saying, okay, I need to hear that again, you can click on the button that says listen or watch. It'll be up on, of course, our YouTube channel. And so that is one thing that you can do. You can also go to many of the links that we've provided so that you will know more about some of these ministries, some of these organizations, and some of the opportunity to reach out. And of course, I've posted some of these articles that we have mentioned as well. And just before we go, let me mention that my viewpoint commentary today is entitled Anywheres and Somewheres. It is really based on this very well done PragerU video where you have a presentation by the former Canadian Prime Minister, that's Stephen Harper, talked about two different kinds of people and used some of the material from the book, The Road to Somewhere, and that by David Goodhart. It really explains that there was kind of a fault line he saw in Britain between the anywheres and somewheres. Stephen Harper then took the concept and explains why we had what you might call a populist uprising in countries like the United States, and perhaps even explaining why, in some respects, Donald Trump was able to win in 2016. The concept is very easy. Anywheres would include those kinds of people that could really be located anywhere. International bank, a computer company, a consulting firm. And as he says, you wake up in New York, London, Singapore, and feel at home. Your work is not threatened by import competition or technological dislocation. You're one of those people who can live anywhere. But most of us, we live in the somewhere. You're a factory worker, a small business person in retail sales. If something goes badly at your company, or if policy choices by politicians turn out to be wrong, you just can't shift your life to somewhere else. And so in some respects, the anywheres are not affected by things like outsourcing labor, cheap labor, technological imports. The somewheres are, and that's why they started looking to somebody that at least acknowledged that they were dealing with some really difficult issues. And so whether that works again in the 2020 campaign remains to be seen, but it certainly explains one aspect of the 2016 campaign. And I think illustrates again why there's still a number of people who find themselves saying, I'm concerned about, what we do in terms of trade policy, while others go, it really doesn't matter to me at all. And I thought it was a very good piece. And so that's why we talk about it today here on Point of View. The Viewpoints commentary is available, so I would encourage you to sign up and receive it every single day in your inbox. But most importantly, I want to thank Alyssa and Ivy and Andrew for their help behind the scenes. And I hope you'll join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
If you thought the first half of 2020 was newsworthy, can you even imagine what's coming in the next 6 months? Coronavirus, the economy, social unrest, and an election. One thing I know, Point of View plans to be here for every important event. And as June comes to a close, so does our fiscal year. God has provided, but we're still a long way from where we need to be prepared for this important time. As Kerby says in his most recent letter, both Point of View and you have been brought together for such a time as this. God always knows what we need to be prepared, and this is the time to ask yourself, what is my role? Do your part to strengthen God's people for the days to come. Make Point of View your megaphone for the stretch run of 2020. Visit pointofview.net/team and do what you can. Or call 1-800-347-5151. This is not a time where we can afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.